Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm Valerie Ashby, Dean of Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, and I am delighted to welcome David Brooks, leading journalist, social analyst, and political commentator as our keynote speaker for today's Provost Forum. As you know, David is a profound observer of the American way of life and a knowledgeable expert on the current political scene and foreign affairs. His column on the op-ed page of the New York Times launched in September 2003. He has been senior editor at the Weekly Standard, a contributing editor at Newsweek and the Atlantic Monthly, and he is frequently a commentator on NPR, Meet the Press, and PBS's NewsHour. David's books include Bobos in Paradise, The New Upper Class and How They Got There in 2000, On Paradise Drive, How We Live Now and Always Have in the Future Tense 2004, The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement 2011, and The Road to Character 2015. His articles have appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Forbes, The Washington Post, and The Public Interest. While most recently David has taught at Yale, he is no stranger to us here at Duke. In 2006, he was a visiting professor of public policy at the Sanford Institute of Public Policy, where he taught an undergraduate seminar titled Policy Wars, Liberalism and Conservatism in America. In 2010, he delivered to a full house the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture, Politics and Culture in the Age of Obama. One Duke colleague notes, as his multiple columns and books make clear, David takes seriously the best that the Academy has to offer. He engages our ideas and helps translate them to a wider audience. But then he turns around and challenges us on our own turf. Relatively few people in his business do that very much, and almost no one as well as he does. He has a way of saying things that make you stop and reflect. He is not merely telling you things you already knew or felt. He is not merely channeling the passions of the public, but with clever phrasing. Instead, he has the gift of making us all think. In this past Sunday's New York Times opinion piece, David describes our college students as a generation emerging from the wreckage with their loss of faith in big institutions. He asks, how do we make good things happen on the local level and translate them to the national level? How can we create relationships and empathy that serve as a force for coming together? Today, I trust David will help us think about a few of these big questions, and I am delighted to introduce him to you. Welcome with me, David Brooks.
Thank you. It's really good, if a little disorienting, to be back here. It's been like 7 years since I've been here. And the campus is in some ways exactly the same, in some ways utterly transformed. If I'd known you had this new hotel, I would have taught here again. I feel like I'm in Dubai over there. But one of the, there are mixed blessings with getting a column in the New York Times. When I got a call to come to New York in 2003, I rode the train up and I said, if they offer me a column, I'm going to say no. I don't want to do it. I hate writing 800 words. And they offered me they said, would you like to have a column in the New York Times? Instead of just saying no, which is what I'd rehearsed, I said, has anybody ever said no to that question? Has anybody ever turned you down? And they said, no, no one has. And so I had a failure of courage. And I said yes, and at the time I was succeeding William Safire as the conservative columnist at the Times, which is a job I likened to the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not always a lot of company there, but it was a good job. But the downside was I had to stop teaching for a little while, and so I I had to stop teaching at Duke, which was just a tremendous pleasure. And even just as of last week, I still run into students I had while I was here at Sanford, and it was a great pleasure. Since I am familiar with Duke, and you're a Duke audience, I'll be brief, because I know you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. So I'll try to get out of the way of that. I'm going to talk a little about universities and then about the broader culture. And I'm naturally a university person. My parents were academics. As a child, at age 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided I wanted to become a writer of some sort. I remember in high school I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But we had different values, so it wouldn't have worked out. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Brown, and Wesleyan decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And the famous saying about Chicago is, it's where fun goes to die. But my favorite saying about it is, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so I went to Chicago. I majored in history and celibacy at the same time. And I wasn't like today's students. I know I ask my students at Yale now, and I'm sure it's true of Dukies, what are you doing at spring break? It's, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers. They've got all these amazing activities. But I did manage some skills that I noticed in my own students, the ability to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading, primarily. And I did have that bookish thing. I managed, it's true, I managed a boxer named the Kosher Killer. And because we were at the University of Chicago, we didn't practice boxing, we just read books about boxing. And his boxing career lasted 92 seconds, unfortunately, so sometimes it has to work not just in theory but in practice. And I think Chicago did give me the ability to read. I read a lot of books, read broadly, tried to discover different sides of myself. I'm the only man in America who finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love. It's amazing. By page 123, I was actually lactating. I was amazing. And I followed in the tradition of my professors, written some books. My last book, as you just heard, was called Road to Character, and I learned writing that book that writing books on character doesn't give you good character, and even reading books on character doesn't give you good character, but buying books on character does give you good character. So, and I was thinking for this occasion about back on my career at Chicago and what I learned. And the one thing I'll say to the students here is that you'll leave Duke, and Duke will mean a lot to you, but if you're like me, in 40 years or 35 years or 30 years, Duke will be more meaningful to you then than it is now. That you'll realize that your college experience shaped you in ways that it took a long time to really understand. And I suspect you'll be caught up in a profound sense of gratitude for this place, which you may not feel today. And that's because universities, and really good ones, have a couple things going for them. There was an old tradition which used to really dominate universities called the humanistic ideal, that the job of a university was to help form each student's character and soul, to teach them not only how to earn a living, but how to be a good person and understand the meaning of life. And that meant arguing with the greatest people who wrestled with these questions, Augustine, Homer, Aristotle, Goethe, Austin, Marx, and that these great-souled individuals had something to teach us, and in some ways they know us better than we know ourselves. That model for a university has had rivals, especially since World War II, and it's been replaced by what my Yale colleague Tony Kronman calls the research ideal. And that's the idea that the universities really are on the cutting edge of research, and they should specialize. And the way to advance knowledge is through specialization. And that, of course, has given us amazing advances in knowledge, but it's had some negative effects on the humanistic ideal. As Kronman writes, it draws our attention away from the whole of our lives. Specialization draws our attention away from the whole of our lives and require that we focus on some small aspect of them instead. It made the question of the meaning of life appear unprofessional. a question that no responsible teacher of the humanities could henceforth take seriously. The specialized ideal subtly says, ignore the soul behind the curtain. And that's beginning to turn around at my school where I'm teaching Yale. There's one class that has a quarter of the student body in just one course. And it's a positive psychology class on the meaning of life. And I've been teaching a course that my students call Therapy with Brooks, because we just sit and talk about these issues and their boyfriends and how rotten they are. When I went to the University of Chicago, it was an institution, and it remains that has one foot inside the research ideal, does cutting-edge research, but one foot still stubbornly planted in the humanistic ideal, which I'm hoping we can get back to as a way to really cultivate real debate. Now, when I went there in the 1980s, there were still some of the old professors who were refugees from Germany in World War II. And they came, were exiled during the war, and they came believing that the keys to the magic kingdom were in Aristotle, within Hobbes, within these great books. And they preached that with a fervor that was evangelical, and I barely remember the subjects, but I remember this fervor for ideas and for big ideas. There was one professor named Carl Weintraub who taught Western Civ, and toward the end of his life, he wrote to a college classmate of mine, a woman named Carol Quillen, who's now the president of Davidson. He wrote to her about teaching, and he wrote, teaching seems to confront me all too often with moments when I feel like screaming suddenly, oh God, my dear student, why cannot you see that this matter is a real, real matter, often a matter of the very being for the person, for the historical men and women you are looking at, or at least supposed to be looking at. And he thought he would ask these students these profound questions that these men and women had really risked and sometimes given their lives for. And all that came back to him, he thought, were just mere words. They weren't really taking it seriously. And he wrote to Carol, sometimes when I have spent an hour or more pouring all my enthusiasm and sensitivities into an effort to tell these stories in the fullness in which I see and experience them, I feel drained and exhausted. I think it works on the student, but I do not really know. And one of the tragedies of teaching is that sometimes the professors pour more into the class than the students are able to receive, especially at their ages. And hopefully what you're doing is you're planting seeds that blossom in the students later in life when life starts happening to them. And when I look back on what my Chicago professors did and what I think professors here and at all great universities do, at least 5 things leap to mind. The first thing they do was they welcomed us into a tradition of scholarship. In my case, it really was the great books. They said, you're just little peons in this great procession, but at least you're part of it. And that the clash of ideas is this wonderful thing you get to be a part of, this endless conversation which has no end. The second thing they did was they introduced us to the range of moral ecologies. Now we often tell students, go out and find your own philosophy of life. And if your name is Aristotle or Nietzsche, maybe you can do that. Most of us need a little help. And so what we do is we're introduced, and I hope here too, to all the different moral ecologies that have come down to us through history. These great moral systems, and we weren't told which one we had to embrace, but we were encouraged to pick one that seemed right for us. The Greek tradition that emphasizes honor and glory, the Hebraic tradition that emphasizes obedience to law and strictness of conscience, the Christian tradition that emphasizes humility, surrender, and grace, the Enlightenment project based on reason, individual liberty, and personal freedom, all the other ones, German Romanticism, Stoicism, Burkean conservatism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Marxism, and so on and so on. They were all thrust before us, and we could pick one that seemed right. The third thing they did was they taught us how to see. Now, seeing seems like a natural thing. We all look out and we see the world. But I live in Washington, and I write mostly about politics. And I can tell you that seeing reality clearly is not an obvious and natural thing. Most of us see reality filtered through our prejudices, our tribe, our depression, our fear, our insecurity, and our narcissism. And to learn how to see is an art. It means first getting yourself out of the way, but second, being trained by people who are really good at it. John Ruskin, the 19th century art critic, once wrote, "The more I think of it, I find this conclusion more impressed upon me. that the greatest thing a human soul ever does is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. And so to me, some of the great seers who really saw things clearly and had a special capacity to see unpleasant facts, the other side of arguments they'd probably prefer not to see, were people like Tolstoy, George Eliot, George Orwell, Jane Jacobs, C.S. Lewis. A lot of them, especially Orwell and Lewis, wrote for radio. So they would never use a big word when a small word would do. And they just wrote so clearly, and Orwell in particular, his heroism was being a pain in the ass to his own side, because he was especially critical of anything on his own side, which was the left, that he seemed untrue. And that's just an amazing capacity of courage and the ability to see. The fourth thing I think we learned in college was emotional knowledge. We don't really talk about this much at higher ed. We think of students often as brains on sticks, and we try to download information into them. But emotional knowledge is knowing what to feel in certain circumstances and having the right set of feelings. And again, you learn that through encounter with greatness. To read Whitman as he exults in joy, to be with Antigone as she struggles to bury her brother, to travel with Galileo as he follows his discoveries wherever they might lead him, to be with Pascal as he experiences the direct presence of God, to travel with Sylvia Plath to the depth of madness, is not to learn a new fact, but it's to have a new experience. And in some ways, it's to become a deeper person. And you can go out into the world with a wider repertoire of emotions. Now, to go from great to great, forgetting her name, who wrote Love Story, famous country singer, now pop singer, Taylor Swift. I once saw her on, how could I forget that name? God, I call her Tay-Tay, so it's a little. I once saw her on 60 Minutes, and she said, she was asked why her songs were so sad. And she said, well, there are actually 23 different kinds of sadness. There's your dog gets lost sadness, and she played the guitar a certain tune. Your boyfriend dumps you, sadness, do, another tune. Your mom is mad at you, sadness. And she went through all the different kinds of sadness. And I remember thinking, that's emotional intelligence, to have all these little gradations of sadness. And that's what you can learn from great literature. And the fifth thing Chicago did was it reordered our desires and gave us new things to love. Plato had this famous concept called the ladder of loves. And he said if you want to teach somebody, here's what you do. You start by presenting them with a beautiful face. And the student sees a beautiful face and says, that's beautiful. But then he or she realizes there's a higher kind of beauty, which is a beautiful personality. And when he or she sees a higher personality, a higher beauty of the personality, she realizes there's an even higher beauty than that, which is beautiful society, justice. And when the student perceives the beauty of justice, she perceives an even higher beauty than that, which is truth. And when she perceives the beauty of truth, she realizes there's an even higher beauty than that, which is the transcendent oneness of the universe, Plato writes, to which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. And so you climb the ladder of beauties. And in that way, your soul is sort of elevated and satisfied at the same time because you're entering the realms it yearns for. Annie Dillard once wrote, in the deeps are the violence of ourselves, she means. In the deeps of ourselves are the violence and terror of which psychology has warned us. But if you ride these monsters down, if you drop with them farther over the world's rim, you find what our sciences cannot locate or name. The substrate, the ocean, or matrix, or ether, which buoys the rest, which gives goodness its power for good, and evil its powerful evil, the unified field, our complex and inexplicable caring for each other and for our lives together here. And so there's just a deepening process that goes on. None of us are as deep as the poet Rilke, but we get at what he was saying when he wrote, I am learning to see. I don't know why it is, but everything penetrates more deeply into me and does not stop at the place where until now it always used to finish. I have an inner self of which I was ignorant. Everything goes thither there now. What happens there, I do not know. And And that's just the deepening that comes with being at a place like this 4 years or 6 years or 8 years. And Chicago gave that to me. It just made it, I have a natural proclivity toward shallowness. It was harder to be shallow after spending those 4 years there, and harder all through life. And one of the things that's, I think, happening in a specialized university, and in a university that emphasizes, and in a culture of the meritocracy that emphasizes specialized knowledge, getting ahead, what in one book I called the resume virtues as opposed to the eulogy virtues, is that the deep moral yearnings which every human being has can go unaddressed and unfulfilled. And when they burst out somewhere, because we all want to lead good lives, and sometimes they burst out exclusively in politics, in thinking that you can find your ultimate spiritual fulfillment in politics. Now, to me, that's idolatry. That's asking an intermediate thing to fulfill an ultimate end. Politics, to me, is usually a competition between partial truths. It's a limited activity. The things that really matter to us are our character and our virtue, our relationships, our loves. Politics is important. I spent a lot of my time writing about it, but I wouldn't want to think it was the ultimate thing in my life. And if you're asking it to carry the weight of the ultimate thing, you're going to chase it so hard, it will lead you to fanaticism. And once that fanatical brain enters you, and the problem of identity, at first it seems to work, like you're pushing for a cause and you feel the sense of fulfillment. But with any sort of idol, the more you ask, the less it gives. And finally, it asks everything from you and gives nothing back, like an addiction. And it leads to a sort of tribalism, it leads to intimidation, and it leads to a demand to shut down others. And so if you make politics your idol, if you want it to be your ultimate truth, you become intolerant of other things. And I think that's one of the things that's happening on campus. We've neglected the sources of real depth, and we've tried to fulfill them with an idol. And it's led to all sorts of intimidation, and in some cases, ugliness. I teach at one of the great universities in the world, but I would say the climate of opinion is narrower there now than it was 5 years ago, and it's weirdly narrower there, and on most colleges I go to, than in Washington, D.C. And Washington is not a paragon of open inquiry. So that's one of the things that's happening and that I worry about. The second thing, that this idolatry happened at the exact moment when tribal forces, for other reasons, were rising in society. And I want to talk for a little bit about why tribalism is rising across society and not just in universities. And so I'm going to walk you through what I think is 3 different historical eras. I'm just going to tell you a narrative of the last 50 years or more. And the first era is between 1932 and maybe 1968 or somewhere in the 60s. And this was an era where people were forced to confront these big problems, Depression, World War II, and they were very group-oriented. To confront these things, they had to join big organizations like the Army, labor unions, big companies like GM, and they were deferential to authority, and the ethos might be defined as we're all in this together, very collective-oriented. If you lived on Chicago's South Side, you didn't sort of strike out on your own. You probably followed your father and grandfather into the Nabisco plant there. And you probably joined the same union that they joined. You were probably part of a very tight community. There weren't much TV, there wasn't much air conditioning in the summer, the doors were open and the kids were running through everybody's houses, and the neighbors were deeply into each other's lives, borrowing different sugar, setting up coffee clutches, babysitting co-ops, trading household goods, really tight communities. If somebody asked you where you were from, you didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski. It was the local neighborhood that mattered a lot to you and gave you that tight community, which you needed to survive. And in politics, like in the rest of life, if you wanted to thrive, you joined an organization and you worked your way up, a very hierarchical structure. There was a guy named John Ferry who worked as a Democrat in the Illinois state legislature. Boss Daley, the head of the Chicago machine, put him in the legislature and let him serve for 20 years. And then at the end of the 20 years, Daley said to him, listen, you've served me well. Why don't, as a reward, I'm going to send you to Congress for 2 years so you can finish your career in Washington. You can say you're a congressman. And so ferry went to Chicago, and he was asked by the reporters how he would vote once he got to Congress in Washington. And he replied, "I would go to Washington to help represent Mayor Daley. For 21 years, I represented the mayor in the legislature, and he was always right." Now, that level of deference doesn't exist much anymore, and that level of structure. And that ethos, we're all in this together, had a lot of good qualities. Strong culture of community, solidarity, humility. It had some bad features too. Racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, emotional coldness. Dads were especially bad at expressing their emotion to their kids. The food was really boring. And so it had to be gotten rid of. I read a book by a theorist, and she has this theory that cultural progress moves forward by a pattern of ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet. That is, the culture solves a problem and creates a culture. It lasts for a while and it works. Then sort of it stops working, so people take a hatchet to it, and then they pivot and they build a new culture, and that works for a little while. And so progress goes that way. And one of the points here is never underestimate the power of human ingenuity. These hatchet periods are rough. 1848, 1905, 1968, today. And it's easy to get pessimistic, but it's just a rough period before the next ratchet. And so that old culture had to be done away with. And a new culture took its place in the 60s. And the change in that from one culture to another is symbolized to me for football fans by a single game, which was Super Bowl III, which happened in 69 or 70. And there were two great quarterbacks on the field that day, both of which grew up miles from each other in western Pennsylvania. On one side, the Baltimore Colts, was a guy named Johnny Unitas. He was a typical 1950s guy. Crew cut, high-top shoes, boring white button-down shirts when he was off the field. He earned $150 a week on a job at a container company, even during the season. And he was boring, but workmanlike. On the other side was a guy named Joe Namath. Wore $5,000 for coats, posed for pantyhose in commercials, had long hair, he was a swinger. He said, "I'm not institutional, I just like to have free sex all the time." He wrote a book called "I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day." And so Johnny Unitas would not have called his memoir that. And so there was a shift in culture. From young, it became cooler to be young, not old, expressive, not reticent, casual, not formal, rebel, not a conformist, individual, not institutional. And the new ethos was tremendously individualistic. A group of young people got together in Port Huron, Michigan in 1962 and said, "We're tired of the old conformity. We want to be individual. We want to be creative." And the new ethos could be, "I'm free to be myself." And it created a lot of great things, this ethos. Gave us the civil rights movement, feminism, the peace movement, made a much more creative culture. It's hard for me to believe there would have been the information age economy, Silicon Valley, without the individualistic, rebellious, creative culture that came out of the 1960s. And I wrote a book called Bobos in Paradise about this culture, about people with 60s values and 90s money. So like people shop in Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and places where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International, those sorts of places. My favorite section of the Trader Joe's is the snack food section, because they couldn't have pretzels or potato chips. That would be vulgar. They have these seaweed-based snacks. We used to get one called Veggie Booty with Kale, which is for kids who come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colorectal cancer." And that was, and so it was obviously a good culture. And it was all about liberation. To be liberated by education from the bonds of religion, liberated by democracy from the bonds of class, liberated by culture from restrictions on sexual and free expression, by technology from poverty, from the ballot box by government. And it did a lot of good things. But it seems to me now we're running out the string on that culture. And it manifests itself in three overlapping crises. The first is a crisis of isolation. In 1980, 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Now twice as many do. And 35% of people over 45 are chronically lonely. A generation ago, only 8% of Americans lived alone. Now 30% do. In 1970, married couples entertained friends in their homes on average 15 times a year. Now it's 8 times. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. And loneliness manifests itself most seriously in the rise in suicide rates, which has been taking place since 1999. There are now many more people die of suicide than in car crash, and especially in the rise of opiate addiction. 55 or 65,000 people a year dying of opiate addiction. And these are just proxies for solitude and loneliness. The second crisis is a crisis of institutions, of alienation. People saying they don't trust the institutions, the organizations around them. It used to be if you asked people, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time, 80%, in the age of we're in this together, 80% said, yeah, I do. Now it's 19%. It used to be if you asked people, do you trust people around you, your neighbors? It used to be 60%. Now 32% say my neighbors are trustworthy, and only 19% of millennials. The loss of faith in institutions happened pretty suddenly and across all age groups. It happened because Johnson lied about Vietnam. It happened because of the civil rights movement. It happened because of Watergate. The loss of faith in each other is totally cohort-driven. If you're in your 70s, you probably still have high faith in your neighbors. If you're in your 20s, you probably have low faith in your neighbors. And it's been going down with every cohort. And my friend Bob Putnam at Harvard says that's because it's not because people trust less. It's because people are actually less trustworthy. It's reality, not a perception. Neighbors are behaving worse toward each other. And so that's the second crisis. And the third is this crisis of meaning, what I call a telos crisis, crisis of purpose. That's part related to our educational system that doesn't give people the moral vocabulary, which I described before, in part because we just are inarticulate about these ultimate ends. I've come to know it in my students. They graduate from Yale, and then a couple years later, they call me with a totally changed tone of voice. They've had a setback, either a romantic breakup, they got fired from their job, something really bad happened, and they're flailing. Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. But if you don't know why you're doing it, every setback becomes a major existential crisis. And you see that, I see it in young people, and especially the 20s have become such a challenging period. David Foster Wallace, as usual, captured it early. He described it as something that doesn't have much to do with physical circumstances or the economy or the stuff that gets talked about in the news. It's more like a stomach-level sadness. I see it in myself and my friends in different ways. It manifests itself in a kind of lostness. This is a generation that has an inheritance of absolutely nothing as far as moral values are concerned. And so when you leave people naked and alone, which is, I think, what the excesses of our individualistic culture have done, they do what evolution tells them to do. They revert to tribe. And to me, that's what's happening on the right and on the left. And what you see is the rise of populism. And the populists understood, I spent an afternoon a couple months ago with Steve Bannon, and it was fascinating to do it. It was like being with Trotsky in 1905. I mean, the guy knew who his intellectual forebears were. He had a 50-year plan to how to take over America. He knew which institution he was going to take over. He was going to take over the Heritage Foundation then, and this Senate seat and that. And he had a whole plan based on the idea that diversity and openness is evil, and tribalism is the natural order of human sociability. And we need to restore those tribes. And people like that, and Donald Trump is in his own way, understood the core problem, understood the isolation and neglect a lot of people were feeling before people like me did. They understood we're not having normal debates anymore between big government and small government. We're having a debate between open and closed. People who feel the meritocracy and globalization are pushing them forward and they welcome openness, and people who feel it's smashing in their faces and they want some security, they want some closeness. People like Trump and Bannon understood they don't have to, at the end of at a period of cultural hatchet, you don't necessarily have to replace the old system, you just have to tear it down. In the 60s, there was a guy named Abbie Hoffman who was not a political genius, but he was good at political theater, and he was good at exposing the weaknesses of the old system. And in my view, he's not only this, but Donald Trump is the Abbie Hoffman of our day. He just exposes all the weaknesses in our culture, all the divisions, and he jams a red-hot poker into it and gets us all riled up all the time. And so tribalism now dominates our politics and much else. You see it in the form of negative polarization. If you ask people, do you like your own political party? People say, not really. Do you hate the other one? Totally. And so people are much more driven by hatred of the other side than by the affection for their own. And the tribalists have a distinct and powerful mentality, which is always an us-them mentality. Trump is genius at making friend-enemy distinctions. The core of life is conflict and combat. It's a warrior mentality. Everything is zero-sum. Politics is war. Ideas are combat. Society is tribal. And you see it in the impulse to erect barriers, to build walls, to silence enemies. Mistrust is the worldview. And that's true on the right, often out in the country, and it's true on the left, often in campuses, where the unwillingness to, the desire to define what's acceptable gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and people are put outside the gates. And the good news for me, and for those of us who aren't really happy with a tribal alternative, we don't want, like we had one era, we're in this together, I'm free to be myself, return to tribe, we'd rather not have that third one, is that in my view, there are a series of moves, even in this era of surging illiberalism. I covered Europe between 1989 and 1995, and during my time there, I covered amazing bits of good news. The end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the Oslo peace process. It was just like one good news story after another. And then at the end, there was one little thing I barely paid attention to, which was the Yugoslav Civil War, the Serbs and the Bosnians. In retrospect, the Yugoslav Civil War was the most important event I covered because it led to what we've seen since. All the tribalism, a lot of the ugliness. And so we're in that moment of surging illiberalism. And yet, what you see around the country, and I just talked to a young man who's part of it, is hundreds of people, hundreds of organizations, hundreds of universities who spent the last year sort of shocked and appalled, suddenly coming out of their bunkers and saying, you know, we want to do something affirmative. We don't want that tribal future. We want something else, and we want to change the rules. And I've been contacted by hundreds of the organizations, and even events like this one I think are part of it. And one thing I've noticed about these new, just getting born efforts, and about a lot of us, is first, we know what we're against more than we know what we're for. We have words like cultural pluralism, ethnic diversity, civic conversation, the free flow of ideas, religious liberty, global interdependence, but we don't quite know how it all adds up into a belief system. A lot of us, myself included, have taken liberalism for granted for so long, we've forgotten what the arguments for it are. And I've tried to go back to John Stuart Mill and Thomas Mann and people like that, who really were the first arguers for it, and who really argued, Walt Whitman, that democracy is not just like a neutral process you use to elect people, it's an entire way of life. And try to remember what that is. Second, a lot of us are dispersed and disorganized. It reminds me a little of the progressive era. In 1905, all these organizations got started all at once, sort of like today, although they were more successful. So the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Boys and Girls Scouts, the NAACP, a lot of the unions, the environmental movement, the social gospel movement, the temperance movement. And they were all dispersed. But then somebody, maybe it was Herbert Crowley, maybe it was Teddy Roosevelt, said, no, you're all part of one thing. You're all part of the progressive movement. And we haven't quite got to that point where the defenders of liberal democracy realize, oh yeah, we're part of one thing. And so power has been decentralized. The third thing is we're demoralized and defensive, and a lot of us feel homeless. And so it seems to me the first job is to bring people together who don't want tribalism, who want something else, and to form them into one movement. I've noticed the organizations sort of fall into about 5 or 6 different lanes. There's a civic education lane, restore the idea of democracy. There's an economic mobility lane to heal the wounds of class division. There's a social capital lane to heal the divides of community. There's a depolarization lane, bring left and right together to heal the wounds of political divide. There's a spiritual sermon lane to restore the sense of crisis, the loss of purpose. And then there's an international lane. How do we recreate a world order? And all these different organizations are getting started. It would be nice if we could bring them all together to figure out communally what we're for and how we can strategize a future and to hold up a better way to live. I mentioned the Port Huron Statement in 1962. It was a very intelligent statement in some ways. And the one thing they really understood is that social transformation follows personal transformation. You have to give people a way to live and to improve their own lives at a higher level in order to create social transformation. And that's sort of what has to happen here. Change is not just out there. It has to happen within all of us, that we live in a way that respects the values that we cherish and are shown how to live that. And so I'll just end with one thing, and that is if we're not going to have a return to tribe, what else can there be? And my hope is that it'll be a different kind of mindset, which is a mindset of commitment making, a mindset of really throwing yourself into large causes. And to me, most of us in the course of our lives make 4 big commitments: to a spouse and a family, to a vocation, to a philosophy and faith, and to a community and friends. And the success and fulfillment of our lives depends on how well we choose and execute upon those commitments. A commitment is making a promise to something. A commitment is offering to something without expecting a return. A commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. Jews love their God, but they keep kosher just in case. They need a structure of behavior. We all need a structure of behavior. And the difference between tribalism and commitment making is that tribalism really is based on hate. Tribalism is always defined by an other and the building the walls and erecting a boundary. Commitment making always starts from a position of love. You go back to the first, and one of the most famous commitments in biblical history is what Ruth said to Naomi: "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." It was that personal love they had for each other. That was the basis of it. I ran across this story in Houston. I ran into a guy, and he's a hairdresser, and he told me this story about himself, his own life. There was a woman in Houston who was a pianist, concert pianist, and she was moving to San Francisco to be with her fiance. And before she moved, she decided she'd get her hair done. So she went to this salon called Etude de Paris, and she walked in there, and she sees this guy who runs the salon cutting somebody else's hair. She goes back to the place where you put on the gowns, and she calls her mom. And she says, "I've just seen the man I'm going to marry." And she gets out, gets her hair washed. She's sitting with the proprietor. He's cutting her hair. Turns out his name is David. And he's asking her life story. And she says to him, "You know, I'm a concert pianist. I was going to move to San Francisco to be with my fiance, but I won't do it if you'll marry me." And so as David tells the story, I looked down at my scissors, and I never felt more free than I did at that instant. And he said, "It's a deal." And they've been married for 17 years. Now, most of us don't fall in love that quickly. But we do fall in love with things. We fall in love with a person. We fall in love with an institution. We fall in love with a field of study. We feel in love with a community, a vocation, a philosophy or faith. And that love gives us our identity. It gives us our sense of purpose and meaning, especially when you combine all these different commitments. It gives us a higher definition of freedom. We think in this old culture that freedom is the absence of restraint, but sometimes freedom comes out of restraint. To have the freedom to really play the piano, you have to tie yourself down to the piano. And finally, it gives us our moral character that is the thing that really satisfies us. When my oldest child was born, we were living in Brussels at the time, and he had a super low APGAR score. And so when he came out, he was whisked by the doctors off to the intensive care ward. And you really don't know what's going on at a moment like that. And I remember having this thought, I didn't know whether he'd live or die. If he just lived for 30 minutes, would it be worth a lifetime of grief for his mom and I? And before you have kids, you think, no, of course not. A creature that really is not conscious of itself 30 minutes versus a lifetime of grief, that makes no sense. But I suspect for the parents in this room, they'll think, of course it makes sense. That once you experience the commitment and the love you have for the child, which you didn't even know existed, once you didn't even know that level of love existed, once you experiencing that, you realize the infinite dignity and worth of a child's life, even for 30 minutes. And once you get pulled into that, you are pulled into a commitment so much deeper than anything you could have fathomed. And when you are pulled into a commitment that deep, then you start doing things you never could have imagined. You used to be the guy who went out, went running when you feel like it, but now you're pushing the baby carriage. You're sacrificing a lot more than you ever thought capable. After those sacrifices, they get engraved into a form of character. And after that character, you become a different person. And long enough, you just look outside at your kid. And I always remember there's one time I drove home from doing the news hour on PBS, and I happened to drive inside my driveway, and it came up on the side of my house, and I looked into my backyard, and then my 3 kids, by that point, 12, 9, and 7, were in the backyard playing with a ball. They were kicking it up in the air, and they were running across the yard and laughing and giggling and having the greatest possible time. And I'm just confronted with this tableau of family happiness. And I look through my windshield just staring at this thing. And at those moments, you experience a joy that's greater than anything you could feel on the job. And you just time stops, and you just want to be worthy of that kind of happiness. And that's the thing that comes out of commitment. And when you've organized your life around loving commitments, it's not us, them, friend, enemy. It's each commitment is nestled in another. Burke said that little platoons are nestled in the town is nestled in the region in the country in the world. And that it's not conflict, but it's just a series of nestlings. And that is the kind of community where you can trust each other's differences, you can be tolerant and love each other's disagreements, and you start from the premises, I don't know who this person is on campus, but I know they're in some way my brother and sister, and so I will listen to them. And that's the kind of thing that makes for civil and exciting debate. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now I've left 10 minutes for a question and answer. We can now talk about Paul Manafort. If anybody has questions, I assume there'll be microphones. I think I see one down here. There's a gentleman right here in the 3rd row. And please try to make your questions long, rambling statements with no question at the end.
Hi there, I'm Matt King. I'm a senior here at Duke, and you've written a lot about elite failure. My question's short: how do we get better elites?
Yeah, it's go to UNC. No, I'm kidding. He loses the crowd with one unfortunate remark. It's been a paradox to me that we've done so much to make the meritocracy so much more fair. It used to be the people who ran our government in 1948 were like white males who came over in the Mayflower or the boat after that. And we've totally increased the talent pool, and we've, not perfect, but we made a lot of progress in opening up to talent. And yet, would we say our government works better? Would we say our media works better? Would we say our financial world works better? It's not clear to me that's the case, and it's a great paradox to me. And partly I think it's some of the challenges of the meritocracy, but I think the big difference is that elite, even though they all went to Hotchkiss and Groton and all those kind of places, they did serve in the war and they did know their country. And a lot of us live in much more isolated areas and don't know our country as well. And so, the obvious thing is some form of national service. My partner, Mark Shields, says the first time he ever met an African-American man in his whole life was when he showered with him in the Marine Corps. And so we have nothing like that. And so doing that seems to be one of the things, but I just sort of think it's a responsibility for all of us to be part of some organization that's filled with people completely unlike ourselves. I mentioned Bob Putnam. He says there are two kinds of capital, bonding capital and bridging capital. Bonding capital is what you build with your own community. Bridging is to another community. And it seems to me what we really need is a lot more bridging capital.
Thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Michael, and I'm a first-year law student. In this time of declining trust in institutions, illiberalism, declining religiosity, who will be left to build up the next culture when the next ratchet period comes along?
Yeah. So I'm pretty much thinking it'll be 56-year-old white guys. No, it's not. It's going to be you. And it's going to be people who are under 30. And it's going to look a lot more diverse than it looks. And so I've been traveling around campuses. I wrote one column trying to understand what's in the minds of people under 30. What country do they want to build? And one of the things I found was a lot of disillusionment with big organizations and with institutions. There's been a lot of institutional failures. If you were born in any time after 1985, you've seen a lot of institutional failure: financial crisis, Iraq, bad election, government that's not working. But the thing that, frankly, but what you see is a great faith and a great skill in creating decentralized movements that can take off very quickly and have huge effects. One of the interesting things about the social movements like Me Too or Never Again or Black Lives Matter is that you don't know there's no one leader. There's no famous person atop them. They are just filled with agency spread across the system. And even the Trump campaign, even though it had one leader, he was authoritarian in message. He was not in his campaign. The campaign was very decentralized. It was just one guy with Facebook. And so that's the model. And I don't quite know how to navigate that model, but that's somehow probably going to be the model. The one thing that I will say depresses me is going around from college to college, how little a lot of the students I talked to knew about American history or felt a sense of American identity. And so I was raised, in this immigrant mentality that America was this great promised land that we were trying to build. And to live here, to be the inheritor of Whitman and Jefferson and Hamilton, was this great gift. And it was what brought us together, or will bring us together. Langston used the America that will be. And I sense precious little of that. Sometimes I think that the way American history is taught in high schools is a really destructive force these days. And so fixing that, getting the civic idea that romanticism, maybe it's a lost cause, but it's a cause I really lament.
Good afternoon. My name is Derek Higgins. I work here with our health system. And part of what you've said, I think, kind of bridging the gap extends from leading from love. But as we've continued to focus on in some of the earlier commentary in the talks before, how our civil discourse is coarsened. It's come to the point, as you've said, we've gone back into this tribalism. The movements that would be led, and if you go back to just recent history, so you look at the people who tried furiously in the 99%, that fizzled. Then you had Black Lives Matter, which in a strange way became almost victimized by what it was. It's almost like somebody wanted to be the new Black Panther Party, and we got to find a way to tamp it down. These movements that would be led by young people, even though social media seems to be a destructor in communication, it's sort of the life's blood of how these things perpetuate and go on. So now we've got a movement afoot. Will young people be able to further the discussion on gun control in this country? And immediately, we've seen people come and try to tamp it down. How are we to see, I guess, a younger generation ever get to that point of really pulling together and trying to affect change? an article I read earlier this week, and just the civil rights movement, the bus tour that took place in the early 60s. A lot of these people, John Lewis included, they were 16, 17, 18 years old. Diane Nash at the time. These people, they didn't have social media, but they led a movement that gained footing. We can't seem to turn the corner. And now that we've got the ability to push a message out throughout everybody, we can't seem to get anything going again. And so just from some of the things you've said, how do we continue to show a younger generation that there is faith and commitment in being able to make a movement forward, go forward, how they can apply themselves to it? Because I think as we've seen in recent history, a lot of these things never get enough critical mass. And so their lifeblood gets pulled away from them as the rest of the people try to look and maintain the tribalism.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. As I said, I'm sort of on the cusp of optimism, just because I feel so much happening all of a sudden, not only with the gun control, but also all the other organizations that are springing into being. Now, I go back to history. How did it develop the last time? I keep going back to the progressive era. There are two times I've focused on where countries really turned themselves around without a war. And one was Britain between 1820 and 1848, and the other was the progressive era in this country. And what happened in the progressive era is they had a super individualistic ethos preceding them, which in the 19th century was called social Darwinism. And they were defeated by a much more communal ethos called the social gospel. So the intellectual victory happened first, and then the community victory happened second, the creation of all those organizations I mentioned, and then the political victory happened third. And so that's at least one way you can think about it happening. And so to me, I do think it's not hard to find reasonable, loving people in this country. They just don't, but they're all unhappy with the way the world is, and whatever that famous poem that everybody overquotes, but it's always applicable. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with furious intensity. I do think that's the moment, but it doesn't need to be. I would say that the people who, and younger than me, who are going to lead the next era, they have to master something, which is how to combine wide agency with some kind of structure. So the Occupy movement had wide agency but no structure, and it collapsed. You can imagine a movement that has total structure, but nobody's going to join it because a generation growing up on Facebook and all this, they're not going to be happy voting once every 4 years. That's not going to be the definition of participation. And so there has to be a marriage of those two things, and I don't think anybody's quite found that thing. But the third thing, and I come back to, is just ideas. Getting to a sense of why we all do need to stick together. And then just a stubborn sense of just healing. Like, we will heal. Just willful saying, I will not hate the people I'm supposed to hate, the objectified other. I was at a Nats game, Washington baseball team, and a guy in front of me turned around in the ninth inning, fortunately, and he said, "Are you David Brooks?" And I said yes, hoping I would get some compliments. And he said, "Well, you're an effing idiot." And he kept repeating that, and then my son leaned in to stop him and said, "You should be ashamed of your dad. He's an evil man. I'm in the presence of pure evil." And sort of like he was going at me. And the phrase, "love your enemies," it came to me later. I wish it had come to me at that moment. But I do think that is really the only way to get through this, to show, say, if, like me, you're in favor of some sort of gun restrictions, to show the people who own guns you're not disrespecting your culture, that you value those people. They're peaceful, law-abiding citizens who are a valuable part of this country, and we're going to work together to solve this. It's never us, them. You just got to get out of that warrior mentality. And it's the mentality that's the common enemy as much as anything else. Maybe one more if there's one more question. Whoever is. Oh, no,
Hey,
that's it.
No,
I'm being.
I got one? No, we're good? Okay. Hi, David. Judy Merzak, retired teacher, second-year business school student, so went straight into business. What I'm wondering about is, you spoke earlier about this crisis of trustworthiness, not just a crisis of trust, but the actual trustworthiness. You also spoke about the need to practice making commitments. And aside from having a child, what are some ways that we can practice making those commitments, given that, given that reality of the trustworthiness ecosystem or environment that we live in?
Yeah, the students would be glad to know there are ways other than having a child. You know, I do think it's like in community, enmeshing yourself in community. That's one of them. That's how many of us are really enmeshed in the geographic community we live in. Or a philosophy, or a faith, or a vocation. But I'll just end with a couple that's really done this in, to me, a way that really is inspiring and has carried me through the last 3 years. I have two friends named Kathy and David. They're roughly my age. And they had a kid named Santi who went to a DC public school. And Santi had a friend whose mom had some drug and health issues, and the dad was split, so he had no place to eat. And so they said, well, James can stay with us or eat with us whenever he feels like it. And so he did, but then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, that kid had a friend. And so now when you go to Kathy and David's house, there's mattresses all over the basement, there's kids all living everywhere. And so I go to dinner there every Thursday, and there's, except for today, and there are 30 or 40 kids around the dinner table. And a lot of them have not been around a dinner table since they were 10. Now they're 18 or 19 or 20. And the first time I went there, I went to shake a kid's hand, and he said, we don't really shake hands here, we hug here. And I'm like, I'm not the most emotionally expressive guy, but we all hug. And so that has just become a node. They have a complete intolerance for social distance. And it's become so meaningful for me to go there and be in that community. And so that's the kind of thing that if it's hard, like I had 3 kids, it drives you crazy to have 3 kids. It's hard to have 30. But it's stressful, and there are some days that are good and some that are really bad. But that's what a commitment looks like. And we don't all have to invite 30 kids into our home, but that sort of thing is an enmeshed life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again for that wonderful lecture. We really appreciate it. And now I am told that I'm supposed to give you strict instructions. You are to go directly to Penn Pavilion and be there by 2:15. Do not stop, do not hug, do not... And you may go even if you're not registered. We'll try to accommodate those who are not registered. So if you would please head in that direction, we'll see you there.